A millionaire CEO stopped when a little girl tugged his sleeve outside the hospital and asked, "Can I call you Dad, just until my mom wakes up?" The night air was sharp and cold, biting at the skin like small needles as snowflakes drifted down under the flickering hospital lights. A small girl named Lily stood alone near the sliding glass doors, clutching a worn-out stuffed bunny that had once been white but was now gray from years of use. She was only 5, too young to understand the weight of the world that seemed to have fallen on her tiny shoulders. Her blonde hair, tied into uneven braids, was messy from sleeping in the hospital lobby the night before. She had been told she couldn't stay there anymore without an adult. The security guard had tried to sound gentle, but his voice carried that tone adults use when they don't know what else to say. "You need to wait outside until someone comes for you," he had said, and then the doors had closed, leaving her out in the cold. She pressed her little hands together and blew warm air on them, her breath forming small clouds. The world around her was so big, so indifferent. She didn't understand how everything could just keep moving when her mother, her whole world, was lying upstairs, still and pale, attached to machines that hummed and blinked. People walked past her, their faces buried in scarves, their minds full of their own problems. None of them noticed the small child in the thin white dress, trembling in the winter wind. She kept glancing at the hospital entrance, hoping someone would come out and tell her that her mom was awake, that she could go home, that everything would be fine. But no one did. Her father had left months ago. He hadn't even called. She didn't know where he went or if he cared. Her mother always told her, "He's just lost, sweetheart." Sometimes grown-ups get lost too. But Lily thought maybe he wasn't lost, maybe he just didn't want to be found. The last time she saw her mother was a week ago, before the car crash. They had been laughing about something silly. Lily remembered her mom's hand brushing her hair back, her soft voice promising pancakes in the morning. Now the house was empty, and the pancakes never came. She wrapped her small arms tighter around her bunny and tried not to cry, but the tears kept slipping down her cheeks, freezing before they fell. She thought about the stories her mom used to tell her before bed, stories about angels who watched over people, about kindness, about how good things always found their way back. But right now, she couldn't feel anything good. She only felt the cold and the hollow ache in her chest. The hospital's automatic doors opened with a hiss, and for a second, warm air brushed against her face. A tall man in a light blue suit stepped outside, his polished shoes crunching against the snow. He looked out of place here, too elegant, too powerful. His dark hair glistened under the light, and his eyes, a piercing shade of blue, scanned the parking lot until they landed on her. He paused. For a moment, he thought she might be someone's lost child waiting for her parents. But then he saw the exhaustion in her eyes, the slight tremble of her lips, and the way she hugged that toy like it was the only thing keeping her safe. He hesitated, unsure if he should approach. His life didn't have room for interruptions like this. He was Ethan Rivers, CEO of one of the biggest companies in the city, a man used to control, order, and distance. But something about the small figure in the snow made his chest tighten in a way he hadn't felt in years. Lily saw him too, standing there in his perfect suit, looking like he had stepped out of one of those glossy magazines in the hospital waiting room. She didn't know who he was, only that he looked warm, and she was so terribly cold. She took a tiny step toward him, her voice trembling as she whispered, "Mister, can I just sit in your car? It looks warm." Ethan froze. Her words hit him harder than they should have. For a second, he didn't know what to say. The wind howled around them, lifting a few strands of her hair across her face. He saw her bare hands, her reddened nose, and realized she had been standing there for hours. Without thinking, he took off his coat and knelt to place it gently around her shoulders. "It's too cold to be out here," he said quietly. She looked up at him with those wide blue eyes that were too full of pain for someone so young. "My mom's sleeping," she murmured. "They won't let me in without a grown-up." He looked at her, really looked, and something inside him shifted. In that moment, the man who thought he had everything, money, power, respect, felt a kind of helplessness he didn't know existed. He didn't know yet that this little girl, standing in the snow with tears on her cheeks, was about to change everything in his life. Ethan hesitated for a long moment, holding his coat around the girl's shoulders as the wind whipped through the hospital parking lot. He wasn't sure what to do. His schedule was full, his driver was waiting, and his phone was buzzing in his pocket with messages from his assistant about an urgent meeting. But none of that seemed to matter when he looked at her. There was something about the way she stood there, so small, so fragile, and yet trying so hard to be brave, that made him stay. "What's your name?" he finally asked, his voice quieter than usual, stripped of the cold authority people were used to hearing from him. "Lily," she whispered, rubbing her hands together for warmth. "I'm 5. He smiled faintly despite himself. "5, he repeated softly. "That's a good age." She tilted her head curiously, studying him as if trying to decide if he was someone she could trust. "You have kind eyes," she said suddenly, and for a man who had spent years surrounded by people who only looked at him with fear, admiration, or calculation, those simple words felt like sunlight breaking through clouds. "Thank you," he murmured, unsure how else to respond. He straightened and glanced at the hospital building. The automatic doors kept opening and closing as people walked in and out, nurses, visitors, delivery workers, all moving past without a second glance. "Where are your parents, Lily?" he asked gently, though he already suspected the answer. Her lips pressed into a thin line as she looked down at her shoes. "Mom's inside. She's sleeping. Dad, he's gone." Her voice cracked at the last word. Ethan crouched again, this time placing a hand lightly on her shoulder. "How long have you been out here?" She shrugged. "Since morning, I think. They said I can't go in without a grown-up. But I don't have one anymore." The words were spoken so simply, without anger or self-pity, that they broke something in him. He took a deep breath, looking around as if searching for someone to tell him what to do. The truth was, he didn't know why he cared so much. Maybe because she reminded him of himself, of the boy he used to be before success, before loss, before he built walls around everything that could hurt him. "All right," he said finally, his tone softer now, almost fatherly. "Let's get you warm first." She looked up in surprise. "But I can't leave. What if she wakes up and I'm not there?" Her eyes filled with tears again, and he could see the depth of her fear, not just of being cold or alone, but of being forgotten. "We're not leaving," he said reassuringly. "We'll go inside, and I'll talk to them. Maybe they'll let you stay if I'm with you." She hesitated for a moment, then nodded slowly, clutching his coat tighter around her. When they entered the hospital together, the nurse at the front desk looked up in surprise. "Sir, visiting hours are almost over," she began, but he raised a hand politely, his presence calm yet commanding. "I understand," he said, his voice steady. "This little girl's mother is a patient here. I'll take responsibility for her while she visits." The nurse hesitated, glancing from Ethan to Lily, then sighed and nodded. "Room 312, she said softly. "Her mother's in critical care. Just don't touch the equipment." As they walked down the long, sterile corridor, the fluorescent lights flickered above them. Lily's small footsteps echoed against the floor, and Ethan noticed how she kept glancing at every passing doctor and nurse, her hope rising and falling with each step. When they reached the door, she stopped and looked up at him. Can you come with me?" she asked quietly. "I'm scared." He hesitated for a second, then nodded and opened the door. The room smelled of antiseptic and something faintly metallic. Machines hummed softly beside the bed where a pale woman lay, her chest rising and falling with the rhythm of the ventilator. Wires and tubes ran from her body to the monitors that beeped in steady intervals. Lily approached the bed slowly, as if afraid she might wake her too suddenly. "Hi, Mommy," she whispered, her voice trembling. "It's me. I brought someone nice." Ethan stood near the door, unsure if he should leave or stay. He watched as Lily took her mother's limp hand and squeezed it gently, tears spilling down her cheeks. "You can wake up now," she murmured, "I've been good. I've been really good." The sound of her voice filled the room, small and fragile, yet carrying a weight that made his throat tighten. He had seen people cry before, employees, partners, even strangers at funerals, but this was different. This was pure, unguarded love. He found himself moving closer without realizing it. "She's beautiful," he said softly, almost to himself. Lily nodded, brushing a strand of hair from her mother's forehead. "She always smells like vanilla," she said. "I don't want her to forget me." Ethan felt something he hadn't felt in years, a deep, aching empathy. He wanted to say something, anything to make it better, but there were no words that could fix what she was feeling. So instead, he did something he had never done before. He simply stayed. They sat in silence for a long time. The hospital lights dimmed slightly as visiting hours ended, and the hallway outside grew quiet. Lily rested her head on the edge of the bed, her small fingers still holding her mother's hand. "Thank you for bringing me here," she whispered sleepily. Ethan, standing beside her, adjusted the coat on her shoulders and replied softly, "You don't need to thank me." She blinked up at him, her eyelids heavy, and smiled faintly. "You look like someone who doesn't smile a lot," she murmured. "Maybe I can teach you." Her words made him chuckle quietly for the first time in years. "Maybe you can," he said. When she finally fell asleep beside her mother's bed, Ethan stood there in silence, watching her small chest rise and fall. He couldn't explain why he didn't leave. Maybe it was guilt, maybe pity, or maybe it was something deeper, an instinct to protect, to stay close, to fill a void that he hadn't even realized was still open inside him. As snow began to fall again outside the hospital windows, Ethan Rivers, the man who believed his heart was long frozen, felt the faintest trace of warmth return. When morning came, the hospital began to stir with the quiet chaos of a new day. Nurses exchanged shifts, the smell of coffee drifted faintly through the halls, and somewhere far off, a patient's television murmured the morning news. Ethan was still in the same chair he had sat in all night, his suit wrinkled, his tie loosened, his phone long dead in his pocket. He hadn't planned to stay, in fact, he couldn't remember the last time he had been so still for so long. But every time he thought about leaving, his eyes went back to the small figure curled up beside the hospital bed, her blonde head resting near her mother's hand, his coat wrapped around her like a blanket. There was something in that image, something so fragile and real, that made him forget everything else. When Lily stirred awake, she blinked sleepily, confused at first about where she was. Then she looked up and saw him sitting there, and her lips curved into a small, tired smile. "You stayed," she said softly, her voice raspy from sleep. Ethan smiled faintly in return. "I did." She rubbed her eyes, then sat up, still clutching her stuffed bunny. "Did my mommy wake up?" she asked hopefully. Ethan's chest tightened as he shook his head gently. "Not yet. But she's still here, sweetheart." Lily looked down at her mother's motionless hand and traced the shape of her fingers with her own. "I keep thinking maybe she can hear me," she said, her little voice trembling. "When I tell her I love her, maybe she hears it somewhere inside." Ethan swallowed hard, unsure how to answer something like that. I think she does, he said finally, and he meant it. After a while, a nurse entered the room and smiled when she saw Lily awake. "Good morning, sweetheart," she said kindly. "You must be hungry." Lily nodded shyly, but when the nurse offered to bring her breakfast, she hesitated. "I don't have money," she whispered. Ethan stood then, his voice calm but firm. "I'll take care of it." The nurse gave him a curious look, clearly recognizing his face. Ethan Rivers was not a man people easily forgot. But she said nothing, only smiled politely and left to get food. When the nurse was gone, Lily turned to him. "You don't have to buy me food," she said earnestly, "I can wait until later." He crouched down to her level again, his eyes steady. "You shouldn't have to wait to eat," he said quietly. "No one should." When breakfast arrived, he helped her open the small plastic containers of oatmeal and fruit. She ate slowly, carefully, as though afraid to waste any of it. Ethan couldn't stop watching her, the way she used both hands to steady the spoon, the way her eyes kept flicking back to her mother, as though afraid something might change while she looked away. She was so small, yet there was an oldness in her, a kind of wisdom that comes only from pain. He realized then that she had probably been taking care of herself for a long time. "You know," he said after a while, "you're very brave." She looked up, startled by the compliment. "Mommy says brave doesn't mean you're not scared," she said thoughtfully. "It just means you keep trying anyway." Ethan smiled faintly, that same ache tightening in his chest again. "Your mom sounds like a smart woman," he murmured. As the morning went on, Ethan checked his phone for the first time. There were dozens of missed calls, several messages from his assistant, and one from a board member asking why he hadn't arrived for the scheduled investor meeting. He turned the screen off without replying. For the first time in his adult life, work didn't feel like the most important thing. He wasn't even sure why. He had spent years building an empire where every second was measured, every decision calculated, yet now all that seemed meaningless next to a little girl sitting by a hospital bed, whispering stories to her unconscious mother. A doctor came in mid-morning, reviewed the monitors, and sighed quietly. "No changes," he said, writing something down. "We'll continue the same treatment for now." He didn't look at Lily as he spoke. To him, she was just another visitor in another room. But Ethan caught the way Lily's small hands clenched into fists. "You mean she's not getting better?" she said sharply, her voice cracking. The doctor froze for a moment, clearly not used to being challenged by a child, then forced a sympathetic smile. "Sometimes these things take time." She turned away, pressing her face into her stuffed bunny so no one would see her cry. Ethan thanked the doctor quietly, then knelt beside her again. "Hey," he said gently, "you heard what he said, it takes time. That means she's still fighting, right?" Lily sniffled, nodding without looking up. "But what if she stops fighting?" she whispered. "What if she forgets me?" Ethan didn't know how to promise something he couldn't control, but he reached out and lifted her chin so she would look at him. "She won't," he said with certainty that surprised even him. "And if you ever get scared, I'll be here until she wakes up. Okay?" That day passed slowly. Ethan stayed through lunch, then through the afternoon. He called his assistant once, told her to cancel all his appointments, and ignored the stunned silence on the other end of the line. He didn't bother to explain. He didn't need to. He spent the rest of the day with Lily, walking her to the hospital cafeteria, helping her pick a sandwich, and watching as she insisted on taking half of it back to her mother's room, in case mommy wakes up hungry. It was such a small, innocent gesture that it nearly undid him. When they returned, she carefully placed the half sandwich on the bedside table and whispered, "See, Mommy? I saved it for you." As evening fell again, the lights in the hospital dimmed, and outside, the snow began to fall once more. Ethan stood by the window, looking out at the white flakes swirling in the dark. Behind him, Lily was coloring on a piece of paper with a few broken crayons a nurse had given her. "What are you drawing?" he asked after a while. "A house," she said simply. "It's me and Mommy. Anne." She paused, glancing up at him. "And you?" He turned, surprised, and she smiled shyly. "You're helping us." For a moment, he couldn't speak. He walked over, crouched beside her, and looked at the drawing. There were 3 stick figures holding hands under a bright yellow sun. He stared at it for a long time before saying softly, "That's a nice house, Lily." She beamed. "It's warm inside," she said. "No one's cold there." When she finally fell asleep that night, curled in the same chair as before, Ethan covered her with his coat once again and sat beside her. He didn't realize he was still holding the drawing in his hand until much later, when the paper began to wrinkle from his grip. He smoothed it out carefully, folded it once, and slipped it into his pocket. He told himself he was keeping it for her, that he would give it back when she woke up. But deep down, he knew the truth: he needed it more than she did. It was a reminder that something good could still exist, even in the middle of all the pain he thought he had left behind. And as he sat there in the quiet hospital room, surrounded by the soft beeping of machines and the sound of Lily's steady breathing, Ethan Rivers, the man who had built his life on control and isolation, realized that for the first time in years, he didn't feel alone. The next morning began with a soft gray light seeping through the hospital blinds, carrying with it the smell of disinfectant and brewed coffee. Ethan hadn't gone home again. He had intended to. He told himself several times throughout the night that he would leave as soon as Lily was asleep, but every time he looked at her small figure curled up near her mother's bed, he couldn't bring himself to walk away. Something about her reminded him of promises he once made and never kept, of people he once loved and then lost. It wasn't pity that kept him there, but something deeper, something that felt like responsibility mixed with guilt, though he didn't know exactly why. When Lily opened her eyes, she blinked as if trying to remember where she was. The first thing she saw was him sitting in the same chair, his elbows resting on his knees, his tired eyes fixed on her mother's monitors. "You didn't go home," she said softly, rubbing her eyes. He smiled faintly. "I didn't want you to be alone." Her lips curved into the smallest smile, and for a moment, she looked almost happy. "Mom would like you," she said. "She likes people who stay." Ethan didn't know how to respond to that. He simply nodded, the words lingering in his chest like a quiet ache. A nurse came in soon after with breakfast for Lily and coffee for him, having long stopped asking why he was still there. People in the hospital had begun to notice him, the sharply dressed man who never left, who spoke softly to the little girl, who looked out of place among the sterile walls and tired faces. But no one said anything. There was something about his presence that felt both heavy and protective, as though he had silently declared this small child his responsibility without even realizing it himself. As Lily ate her breakfast, she told him stories about her mother, how she used to sing while cooking, how she made up bedtime stories that always ended with a happy twist, how she taught her that being kind was better than being rich. Ethan listened carefully, though every word seemed to stab at something inside him. He couldn't remember the last time someone spoke about love with such purity. In his world, people didn't talk about love anymore, they talked about contracts, investments, and returns. The only time he had ever been truly close to someone had been years ago, before success hardened him. That woman had wanted a family, but he had been too consumed by ambition, and she had left. He had told himself it was for the best, but now, watching Lily talk about her mother, he felt the full weight of everything he had traded for the life he had built. Later that day, he met with the doctor privately in the hallway while Lily napped in the chair. The doctor's expression was grave, the kind professionals wore when they'd had to say the same words too many times. "There's little improvement," he said quietly. She's stable, but she hasn't regained consciousness. We'll keep monitoring her, but you should prepare the girl. Ethan's jaw tightened. Prepare her for what? The doctor hesitated, glancing through the glass window at Lily before meeting Ethan's gaze. For the possibility that her mother might not wake up. The words hit harder than he expected, though she wasn't his family. He thought of Lily's voice the night before, whispering promises to her mother, believing that love alone could bring her back. He wanted to believe it too. When he returned to the room, Lily was awake, humming softly as she brushed her mother's hair with the small pink comb a nurse had given her. She likes when I make her look pretty, she said when she noticed him. She used to say even when she's tired, she should still smile. Pretty people smile, she said. Her innocence broke him. He walked closer, crouched beside her, and said gently, "Your mom would be proud of how much you're taking care of her." She looked up at him, her blue eyes bright with quiet hope. "Do you think she'll wake up soon?" she asked. Ethan hesitated for a fraction of a second before answering. "I think she's trying really hard." That seemed to comfort her. Throughout the day, they developed a routine. He would buy her lunch, she would talk about her favorite cartoons or ask him questions about his life, questions he hadn't expected to answer. "Do you have kids?" she asked once, swinging her legs under the chair. "No," he said after a long pause. "I don't." She frowned thoughtfully. "Why not?" He smiled faintly. "I guess I never had time." She tilted her head, studying him like she was trying to see past his words. "You should have time for that," she said seriously. "Kids make people better." He laughed quietly at the simplicity of her wisdom, though deep down, he knew she was right. Later in the afternoon, as snow continued to fall outside, Ethan got a call from his assistant. He stepped into the hallway to take it, lowering his voice. "Sir, the board wants to know where you are." "The quarterly report," he cut her off gently but firmly. "Cancel my meetings for the week." There was silence on the other end. "Sir, that's not possible." "We're days away from," I said cancel them, he repeated, his tone final. When he hung up, he leaned against the wall for a moment, running a hand through his hair. He had built his entire life around control, power, and the illusion of importance. Yet now, standing in a hospital hallway that smelled of antiseptic and coffee, he realized how hollow all of it felt. When he went back inside, Lily was drawing again, this time another picture, her mother smiling, herself holding her hand, and a tall figure beside them that was unmistakably him. "We're a team," she said proudly when she showed it to him. "You're helping me take care of her." He looked at the drawing for a long time, then gently ruffled her hair. "That's the best team I've ever been part of," he said. Her eyes lit up, and she giggled softly before folding the drawing and tucking it under her mother's pillow so she can see it when she wakes up. That night, after Lily had fallen asleep, Ethan found himself sitting beside the hospital bed again. He looked at the woman lying there, pale but peaceful, her chest rising and falling slowly. "Your daughter's incredible," he murmured softly. "You raised her well." He paused, his voice lowering to almost a whisper. "I don't know why I'm here or what I'm supposed to do, but I promise I won't let her go through this alone." The room was quiet except for the rhythmic sound of the machines, but as he spoke, it felt as though something in the air shifted, like his words mattered, like someone was listening. When he finally stood to leave, he turned to look at Lily one last time, asleep with her hand resting on her mother's arm. For the first time in years, Ethan Rivers didn't feel like a stranger in his own life. He felt like he was exactly where he was meant to be. Outside, the snow had stopped, and the first faint light of dawn began to stretch across the sky. It was still cold, still uncertain, but for the first time, he thought maybe there was a chance for warmth again, not just for her, but for him too. The following morning, Ethan woke to the sound of quiet laughter. For a moment, he didn't recognize where he was. The smell of antiseptic and the faint hum of hospital equipment quickly reminded him. Lily was sitting cross-legged on the chair near the window, playing with a paper cup and a few crayons the nurse had left behind. She looked up and smiled when she saw him awake. "You snore," she said matter-of-factly. He blinked, then laughed softly, the sound foreign in his own ears. "I do?" he asked. "Like a bear," she said proudly, as if she'd just discovered something funny. The air in the room felt lighter than it had in days, and Ethan realized that for the first time, the heaviness that clung to this place didn't seem quite as suffocating. He stood and stretched, his back stiff from sleeping in a chair. "You hungry?" he asked. Lily nodded, then bit her lip. "But I think the nurse will be mad if we go to the cafeteria alone." Ethan smiled. "Then we won't go alone. I'll come with you." They walked hand in hand down the corridor, the sight of the tall businessman in a tailored suit and the small blonde girl in her faded pink shoes turning heads as they passed. It wasn't every day someone like him appeared in a place like this, holding the hand of a child who clearly wasn't his. But Ethan didn't care about appearances anymore. He found himself enjoying her company in a way he hadn't enjoyed anything in years. At breakfast, Lily told him about her dreams. "I dreamt Mommy was awake," she said, her blue eyes wide and hopeful. "She said she wasn't tired anymore, and she wanted pancakes. Then we all went outside, and there was sun everywhere." Ethan smiled as she spoke, though his heart ached. He wanted so badly for that dream to be real, for her sake, and maybe for his too. "That sounds like a good dream," he said quietly. "Do you think dreams can come true?" she asked suddenly, her voice serious now. He hesitated. "Sometimes," he said after a pause. "Sometimes they do, if we don't give up." She nodded thoughtfully. "Then I won't give up." Her conviction struck him deeply, her strength wrapped in such smallness. When they returned to the room, a man in a black suit was waiting outside. Ethan immediately recognized him as one of his company's lawyers. "Mr. Rivers," the man said carefully. "I've been trying to reach you. The board is getting anxious. They're asking why you've been unreachable for 3 days." Ethan exhaled slowly, glancing through the window at Lily, who was now sitting by her mother's bedside, brushing her hair again. "Tell them I'm occupied," he said simply. The lawyer blinked, clearly taken aback. "Sir, the press has been asking questions." "If you're seeing," Ethan's eyes darkened. "Let them ask," he interrupted sharply. "They've written worse before. This is more important." The lawyer, realizing there was no argument to be made, nodded stiffly and left. Ethan walked back into the room, his mind still swirling with the implications of his decision. He had spent his entire life building a reputation of control, of distance, of perfection. Now he was risking all of it for something he couldn't explain even to himself. But when he saw Lily turn and wave at him, her small face lighting up with relief at his return, he realized that he didn't care about the cost. For once, he wanted to choose something that mattered beyond himself. That afternoon, a social worker came by. She was polite but firm, asking Ethan who he was and why he was there. "I'm a friend," he said simply. "The girl's mother is in a coma, and she doesn't have anyone else here." The woman gave him a skeptical look. "Mr. Rivers," she said, clearly recognizing his name, "we can't allow unrelated adults to supervise minors overnight." Ethan frowned. "She was out in the cold when I found her." "You want her to go back to that?" The social worker sighed, adjusting her glasses. "Of course not, but there are procedures. If her mother doesn't recover soon, the child may need temporary placement." Lily, who had been listening quietly from the corner, suddenly stood up. "I don't want to go anywhere," she cried, clutching her stuffed bunny to her chest. "I want to stay with Mommy. And with him." Her voice broke, and Ethan felt his heart twist. He knelt down and pulled her close, his hand resting gently on her back as she trembled. "It's all right," he said softly. "No one's taking you away." The social worker's expression softened at the sight. "If you truly want to help, Mr. Rivers," she said quietly, "we can discuss guardianship, at least temporarily. It will require paperwork, background checks, and time." Ethan nodded without hesitation. "Do it," he said firmly. "I'll take care of it." The woman gave him a long look, perhaps surprised by his decisiveness, then smiled faintly. "All right. I'll start the process." Later that night, after Lily had fallen asleep again, Ethan sat alone in the hospital hallway, staring at the sterile floor tiles. He had made countless decisions in his life, mergers worth billions, strategies that affected thousands of employees, but none had ever felt as heavy or as meaningful as the one he had made today. He didn't know why he felt so connected to this child or why her pain mattered more than the empire he had built, but he couldn't ignore it anymore. She had broken through something in him that he hadn't realized was still capable of breaking. As the clock neared midnight, he returned to her room. The light was dim, the machines still humming their endless rhythm. Lily was sleeping peacefully, her small hand resting on her mother's arm. Ethan watched her for a long time, then looked at the woman on the bed. "If you can hear me," he whispered, his voice raw with emotion, "I promise you this, I won't let her suffer. I'll make sure she's safe, no matter what it takes." He paused, running a hand through his hair. "And if you wake up, I'll step back. You'll never have to worry about her again." He sat there until the first pale light of dawn crept through the window, feeling a strange calm settle over him. For the first time in years, his life wasn't about balance sheets or deadlines or power. It was about a promise, to a child who had nothing left, and to a woman who might never open her eyes again. And though he didn't yet know what would happen next, one thing was certain: Ethan Rivers was no longer the same man who had stepped out of his car into the cold that night. Something had changed in him forever, and no amount of money or success could ever undo it. Days passed, and the hospital had begun to feel like a second home to both Ethan and Lily. The sterile white walls, the constant hum of machines, the quiet shuffle of nurses, it all became a rhythm of waiting. Ethan arrived early every morning and stayed late into the night, often sleeping in the same chair near the window. The staff stopped questioning his presence. They began to smile knowingly when he passed, and the nurses started leaving an extra cup of coffee for him on the counter without asking. He was no longer just the powerful CEO they had recognized from magazines. Here, he was something else entirely, a man who sat beside a little girl every day, reading to her, helping her eat, and waiting for a miracle that no one could promise. Lily had grown used to his company. She no longer hesitated before holding his hand or asking him questions that made him pause in ways he hadn't before. "What's your favorite color?" she'd ask while coloring pictures for her mother. He would think for a long moment before answering, realizing he hadn't cared about something so simple in years. "Blue," he'd say finally, and she would grin. "Mine too. Like the sky when it's happy." Sometimes she would tell him stories about the future she wanted, how when her mother woke up, they would live in a small yellow house with flowers in the window and a dog that would bark whenever they laughed too loud. "You can visit us," she said one afternoon, her tone serious. "I'll make you cookies." Ethan smiled at the thought, though deep down he couldn't ignore the fear that her dream might never come true. As the days went on, the doctor's updates remained the same: no progress, no decline. A plateau that felt like hope's cruel cousin. Ethan began to sense the staff avoiding his gaze when they spoke about her mother. There was a quiet acceptance in their eyes, the kind reserved for cases they had seen too many times before. But Lily didn't notice. She continued to talk to her mother as if she could hear every word, telling her about her drawings, her new friend Ethan, and how they were waiting for her to wake up so she could smile again. Sometimes, when Lily spoke like that, Ethan would have to turn away to hide the emotion tightening his chest. He wasn't used to hope anymore. It scared him more than despair ever had. One afternoon, while Ethan was on a phone call in the hallway, Lily wandered into the hospital garden, a small square of green surrounded by concrete walls. When he came looking for her and found her there sitting on a bench, he noticed her face looked different. Her usual light had dimmed. "What's wrong?" he asked, kneeling beside her. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she stared at the tiny patch of flowers in front of her, their petals trembling in the cold breeze. "One of the nurses said my mommy might not wake up," she whispered finally, her voice shaking. "She said sometimes people just don't." Ethan froze. He had wanted to protect her from that truth for as long as possible, but the world had a cruel way of saying what you couldn't. "Hey," he said softly, touching her shoulder, "don't listen to that. They don't know your mom like you do." But Lily shook her head, tears spilling down her cheeks. "What if she doesn't know me anymore? What if she forgets me?" He took a deep breath, his heart breaking at the question. "She won't forget you," he said, his voice trembling now too. "You're the kind of person no one could ever forget." She looked at him through her tears. "You promise?" she asked. He nodded without hesitation. "I promise." Then, without another word, she threw her arms around his neck. For a moment, Ethan just held her, feeling her small frame trembling against him. He had comforted employees during layoffs, negotiated with billionaires, spoken at conferences filled with cameras and lights, but nothing in his life had ever felt as heavy or as real as this. He realized he would have given up every deal, every title, every piece of his success if it meant this child didn't have to hurt like that. The social worker returned later that week with the first round of guardianship paperwork. Ethan filled it out in silence, his signature steady though his mind raced with doubts. He didn't know what he was doing. He wasn't the kind of man who took care of children, he barely knew how to take care of himself. But when the social worker looked at him and said, "This will make you legally responsible for her until her mother's status changes," he didn't flinch. He just nodded and said, "Good." Lily watched quietly from her chair, clutching her stuffed bunny. "Does that mean I can stay?" she asked timidly. Ethan smiled. "That means you're not going anywhere." After that, something shifted between them. Lily began to follow him everywhere, as if she feared that if she let go, he might disappear. She waited for him to come every morning, and when he walked in, her face would light up in a way that made even the nurses smile. He started bringing her small things, a book, a coloring set, a cupcake from the cafe downstairs. He told himself it was to keep her busy, but deep down, he knew it was because he wanted to see that look on her face again. One night, as they sat together by the window watching the snow fall outside, Lily suddenly asked, "Did you ever have a family?" Ethan hesitated, his gaze fixed on the white flakes drifting past the glass. "I did once," he said finally. "A long time ago." "Where are they?" she asked softly. He smiled sadly. "Far away now." She was quiet for a moment before saying, "Maybe you can have one again." He turned to look at her, and for a moment, he couldn't speak. "Maybe," he said eventually, his voice barely above a whisper. It was in that silence that Ethan realized how much this child had changed him. She had stripped away everything false in his life without even trying. She had reminded him of what it meant to care about something with no profit, no outcome, just care for its own sake. When he tucked her in that night, she looked up at him sleepily and whispered, you're not really like the people in the big buildings, are you? He smiled faintly. Maybe not anymore. She yawned and nestled deeper into the chair, her small hand clutching his sleeve as she drifted off to sleep. As the night deepened, Ethan sat in the dark, watching her breathe. Outside, the snow kept falling, covering the city in silence. He thought of the person he had been before all this, cold, precise, untouchable, and wondered if that man was gone for good. Maybe he was. Maybe that was the point. Because now, for the first time in years, he didn't feel like he was chasing something. He felt like he was finding it. And even though the world outside remained frozen, in this small room, there was warmth, fragile, fleeting, but real. It was the warmth of a child who had nothing yet gave him everything he didn't know he needed. The following week began with a sudden rush of tension that shattered the fragile calm Ethan and Lily had built together. It started early in the morning, when the usual soft beeping of the monitors in the hospital room turned sharp and irregular. Nurses hurried in, and before Ethan could process what was happening, Lily's mother's body trembled, her breathing ragged, her face pale against the sheets. Ethan froze for a moment, then instinctively pulled Lily close as she screamed her mother's name. The doctors pushed them gently aside, the room filling with commands and urgent movements. Ethan could only hold Lily as she cried, her small hands clutching his suit jacket so tightly he could feel her shaking through the fabric. Time blurred into a haze of sounds, the monitor's shrill alarm, the doctor's orders, the steady hum of machines fighting to keep someone alive. And then, as suddenly as it began, the noise stopped. The room went quiet except for the faint sound of the machines returning to their rhythmic beeping. The doctor turned toward them with a tired look. "She's stable," he said quietly. "But she's still unconscious." The episode could mean we're nearing a turning point, for better or worse. Ethan nodded numbly, though his focus was on Lily, who was still crying softly against his chest. He carried her out into the hallway and sat on a bench, letting her cry until there were no tears left. "Is she dying?" she whispered finally, her voice so small he could barely hear it. Ethan hesitated, his throat tightening painfully. "I don't know," he said honestly. "But she's still fighting. You have to keep believing in her, all right?" She didn't answer right away, but after a long pause, she nodded, wiping her face with the sleeve of her sweater. "Mommy never gives up," she said firmly. He smiled faintly. "Then neither will we." Over the next few days, Ethan noticed Lily becoming quieter. She still colored and talked to her mother, but her laughter had faded. It hurt him to see her light dimming. He tried everything, brought her little gifts, took her to the hospital garden, even taught her how to fold paper cranes, but nothing seemed to lift her spirit. One afternoon, he found her sitting by the window, staring out at the falling snow. "You know what my mom used to say?" she asked without turning around. "She said snowflakes are like second chances. They fall and disappear, but more always come." Ethan sat down beside her, his gaze following hers. "Your mom sounds like a very wise woman," he said quietly. Lily nodded. "I just wish she could say that again." That night, when Lily fell asleep, Ethan stayed in the room, his thoughts restless. He couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted in him forever. He wasn't the same man who had walked into this hospital weeks ago. He thought about the company he hadn't been to in days, the board members likely whispering about his absence, the empire he had built now running without him. And for the first time in his life, he didn't care. All that mattered was the fragile bond he'd found here, with a little girl who had lost almost everything and somehow still believed in kindness. The next morning, the social worker returned, carrying a folder. She looked at Ethan seriously. "The temporary guardianship has been approved," she said. "Legally, you're responsible for her now until the mother's condition changes or another guardian steps forward." Ethan took the papers, scanning them quickly before signing. "Thank you," he said simply. The social worker paused, her expression softening. "You're doing something good, Mr. Rivers. Most people in your position wouldn't stay." Ethan gave a small smile. "Maybe that's the problem with people in my position." Later that day, he brought Lily a surprise, a new pair of small shoes. "For when your mom wakes up," he said, setting the box on her lap. She looked at him curiously, then opened it, her eyes widening at the sight. They were light pink sneakers with tiny stars along the sides. "They're perfect," she whispered. "Now we can walk home together." Her words hit him harder than he expected. He hadn't realized how much hope she still carried inside her small frame. "Yeah," he said quietly. "We'll walk home together." That evening, the hospital was unusually quiet. Snow fell heavily outside, blanketing the city in white. Lily sat beside her mother's bed, holding her hand and humming softly, the same lullaby Ethan had heard her sing before. He watched from the doorway, something tightening in his chest as he saw the way her small fingers wrapped around her mother's unmoving hand. It was love in its purest form, patient, unconditional, endless. Then, as if responding to that love, the monitors beeped differently, a softer, stronger rhythm. Ethan froze. The nurse rushed in, checking the readings, her eyes widening. "Her heart rate's improving," she said quickly. "She's stabilizing." Ethan felt his pulse race as he turned to Lily, who looked up at him, her face lighting up with a hope so fierce it was almost blinding. "She heard me," she whispered, clutching her mother's hand tighter. "Mommy heard me." The next hours were a blur of cautious optimism. The doctors confirmed it wasn't a full recovery yet, but there was undeniable progress, brain activity increasing, reflexes returning. "It's a good sign," the doctor said, smiling for the first time in weeks. Lily threw her arms around Ethan, crying and laughing at once. "She's coming back," she said. Ethan hugged her tightly, unable to speak. In that moment, he realized something he hadn't before: he wasn't just helping her survive, she was helping him remember how to live. Later that night, when the hospital quieted again, Ethan found himself sitting by the window, staring at the snow outside. His reflection in the glass looked different, tired, older, but softer. The man who had once measured success by power and wealth now measured it by the sound of a child's laughter. He turned back to look at Lily, who was still sitting by her mother, her eyes heavy but bright with hope. He whispered, more to himself than anyone else, "You saved both of us, kid." When he finally stood and tucked a blanket around her shoulders, she stirred slightly, murmuring in her sleep, "Don't go, Daddy." He froze, every muscle in his body tensing. The word hit him like a wave, both painful and beautiful. He brushed a strand of hair from her face and whispered softly, "I'm not going anywhere." For the first time in years, he meant every word. As the night deepened and snow continued to fall outside, Ethan felt something he hadn't felt in a long, long time: peace. Not the kind that came from success or power, but the kind that came from being needed, from giving instead of taking. He looked at Lily's mother one last time before closing his eyes. "Please," he whispered into the quiet room, "come back to her." Then he sat there in silence, waiting, the glow of the machines casting a soft light over them all, like a promise that morning would come again. Morning came softly, the gray light of dawn seeping through the hospital blinds and settling over everything with quiet gentleness. Ethan stirred awake in the chair, his neck aching, his eyes burning from lack of sleep. The world outside the window was covered in a smooth layer of white snow, untouched and still. For a brief moment, he thought he was dreaming, because the air in the room felt different, warmer, lighter, alive. Then he heard a sound that froze him completely. It was faint, but unmistakable, a weak voice, dry from disuse. Lily. The word was barely a whisper, but it was real. Ethan's head snapped toward the hospital bed. Lily's mother was stirring, her eyelids fluttering open for the first time in weeks. He stood quickly, his breath catching in his chest. Lily was still asleep, curled up in the chair beside the bed, her small hand still wrapped around her mother's fingers. The woman's gaze shifted slowly, confusion flickering across her pale face before recognition dawned. Her lips trembled. "My baby," she whispered, her voice breaking. Ethan didn't think, he gently touched Lily's shoulder. "Lily," he said softly, "wake up, sweetheart. Someone wants to see you." The girl blinked awake, rubbing her eyes. "What?" she murmured sleepily, and then she saw. For a split second, her mind didn't seem to believe it. Then, with a gasp that filled the whole room, she jumped to her feet and ran to the bed. "Mommy," she cried, climbing onto the mattress and throwing her arms around her mother's neck. The woman's weak arms rose and wrapped around her, trembling as they held each other. Ethan stood motionless, watching as the two clung to each other, their sobs mingling with the soft beeping of the machines. It was the kind of moment so pure it didn't need words. It was the end of every sleepless night, every whispered prayer, every ounce of pain that had led them here. Lily's mother, whose name he now knew was Sarah, turned her tired eyes toward him after a long while. "You stayed," she said quietly, her voice still fragile but full of gratitude. Ethan hesitated before nodding. "I did. She needed someone." Sarah's gaze softened as she looked at her daughter, then back at him. "And you were that someone." He felt something heavy rise in his throat, and he couldn't speak for a moment. "She's stronger than anyone I've ever met," he managed finally. "You should be proud." Sarah smiled faintly, brushing her fingers over Lily's hair. "I am. More than she'll ever know." The next few days felt like a dream. Doctors came and went, astonished by Sarah's recovery. "It's nothing short of a miracle," one said, shaking his head in disbelief. Lily never left her mother's side, holding her hand even when she slept, as if afraid that if she let go, everything might disappear again. Ethan stayed too, though he found himself stepping back more now, giving them space to rediscover each other. Still, every time Lily turned and smiled at him across the room, he felt something inside him settle, like a piece of himself had found its place again. One afternoon, Sarah asked him to sit with her. She was stronger now, able to sit up and speak without strain. "Lily told me what you did," she said softly. "That you stayed, that you took care of her, that you made her feel safe. I don't have words for what that means." Ethan shook his head. "You don't owe me anything." She smiled knowingly. "That's what makes it mean more." There was a long silence between them before she spoke again. "She told me she calls you Daddy sometimes." He froze, unsure how to respond. "I didn't teach her that," he said quickly. "It just happened." Sarah smiled again, tears shining in her eyes. "I think she saw something good in you. Maybe something you didn't see in yourself." Ethan looked down at his hands, feeling the weight of her words. "I wasn't planning to stay here," he admitted. "The night I found her, I was just trying to do the right thing. But she changed everything." Sarah nodded, understanding. "She has that effect on people. Her father left when she was a baby. She's always been waiting for someone who wouldn't." Ethan looked at her then, and for the first time, he understood the depth of what she meant. He wasn't just helping them, they had given him something in return, something he hadn't known he needed. When Sarah was finally discharged, the three of them stepped out of the hospital together.